But for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about leadership. And today we're going to talk about leading in changing times. How do we lead in changing times? We are in changing times, not just in changing times, but we're also in what is called a new normal. One of the things that's going to get so many people caught in these days is that so many people are looking for the old times to come back. And I'm here to tell you today that the life that you will live from this day forward is all part of the new normal. And as part of the new normal, you're going to have to lead in a different way. Our lives will never go back to the way it was. Let me give you one example of that. I guarantee you now, toilet paper has a whole new meaning to each and every one of us. Now, I bet you won't be caught with 2 or 3 rolls of toilet paper anymore, because here's what these times have taught us. It has taught us that it requires us to think in a different way. And so here's the first thing I want to say today. As godly leaders today, we live in a world that has changed dramatically over just the past 20 years. Daily, we are faced with challenges regarding what it looks like to serve God and lead faithfully in our complex world. Now, let me tell you, there's some things I wrote down that have changed, that has made us change our lives in the past 20 years. Let me just read a few of them to you. Number 1, technology. Boy, whoever would have thought? I remember watching Get Smart, where in Get Smart, now some of you all are not old enough to remember that, but I used to love Get Smart because he was the gadget man. And Get Smart, if you remember, was a man who had a telephone built into his shoe. I remember watching the cartoon Dick Tracy, and Dick Tracy had a watch, which was a telephone. Do you guys remember that? Not too long ago, I remember that when the first iPhone I can remember came out way before Apple did. The first iPhone was that pull-along phone that the babies had that had the little eyes that moved on it. That was probably the first iPhone. But technology has changed so much to when we're going to talk about a little bit more about technology as I give you some updates in the end. But technology has moved us to move up. And let me tell you one thing about technology. If you're one of those people that say, I don't want to learn technology, you better. Because let me tell you something, technology is not going anywhere. Another one is globalization. There was a time where we would think that when we would mention the continent of Africa, or we would mention Asia, or you would just mention other places in the world, it seems like it was so far away. But now the world has been brought so closer through technology and other means that now globalization is a regular thing. People right now all over the world are preparing for jobs and opportunities, even right here in the United States. So globalization has made those things work. Moral relativism continue to transform the way that we communicate. We now even communicate in a different way. We communicate through cell phone and through texts with simple little 3-letter terms. And now when we communicate, it's something totally different. It's not just through mail. There is more emails sent out every day than would probably be touched by the Postal Service in a year. So when we think about how we communicate, how we relate to one another, defining what is right and wrong is changing every day. And in this changing cultural landscape, the young people must grapple with this whole thing of what it means to be loving, tolerant, and faithful to God. But as experienced leaders, teachers, parents, we're faced with the reality that, first of all, we have to be able to help them navigate through these challenges. We have to work with our mentees, our students, and our children as they encounter these things each and every day. So how do we navigate through these times? I wrote down just a few. Number 1, you got to understand the times in which we live. The times in which we live is not just the date, the day, and the year. You need to know where we are in time. The second thing is you've got to know the law of God. You've got to make the law of God your understanding. You've got to spend the time that you need to spend in your Bible, because your opinions today can lead your children, your mentees, your students in the wrong direction. Everybody's looking for answers. Then another thing, you got to learn the language of our culture now. You can't sit back and just be stuck in the 70s or stuck in the 60s. You got to understand the language of the culture, because Everything is talking, and you've got to understand the language that they're speaking. You also got to learn and how to find godly companions. How do you find godly companions in times like these? We all need godly companions. But then we've got to practice godly discipline, and we've got to live these days a trustworthy life. It's so important that we live a trustworthy life. And because godly leadership today is not for the faint at heart, if you want to lead as a godly leader today, it's not something for the faint at heart. You're going to have to put the work in. You're going to have to put the sacrifice that is needed to be a godly leader. You just can't go along to get along. And for so many people, that's what they're doing. Instead of learning and putting in the time and the work that is going to need to become a godly leader, here's what you're doing. You're putting your life on autopilot. You're putting your family on autopilot. You're putting your marriage on autopilot. You're putting your finances on autopilot. And let me tell you, in rough winds and in rough times, it's bad to put your life on autopilot, because when the turbulence of life hits, you need an experienced pilot at the helm of the plane of your life. You can't put your life on autopilot, nor can you trust your life to somebody who may not be licensed to even drive the plane of your life. So many people, here's what you've done. You've taken the leadership of your life and you've put it into the hands of somebody who doesn't, number one, have the license to drive, but even two, don't even understand the directions of the travel. They don't even know the destination that you're trying to get to. So it's so dangerous for you to put your life on autopilot and not lead in times like these, because godly leadership is not for the faint at heart. Here's another one. Rather than do that, it requires courage and humility exemplified in your life. Your faithfulness, my faithfulness, will turn and will determine whether or not there will be a dramatic change in our life which will glorify God. Let me tell you, COVID-19, this pandemic, will set you up for probably the next 20, 30 years of your life. In this time where the world has kind of slowed up to give you a chance to catch up where you are, use this time wisely to become a better leader to your mentees, to your students, to your children, and to your family. Why? God's glory is really needed in this. And God is calling men and women who will sacrificially and boldly live for God's purposes. So what I want to do real quickly, I want to look at a book that I love, that every time I talk about leadership, this is the book that I always go back to and share with mentees and students and my children on a regular basis, because this is a key book of leadership, and it is the book of Nehemiah. Now, we all know Nehemiah's story. I'm going to give you a real quick history in case you don't know the story. Nehemiah had a real cushy job as a cupbearer for the king. What did he do as the cupbearer? Here's what he did. He tasted everything that was given to the king for him to drink. So what would happen is you wouldn't just pass him a cup of water, or you wouldn't just pass him a glass of wine or whatever he was drinking at that time. You would pass it to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah would taste it. And if Nehemiah didn't die, then he knew it was good enough for the king. And so he had this real cushy job, and he came from a place where really what we would all say, he came from a normal town, or for some of us, as I grew up with in the inner city, he came from a place of what we would call the hood, the ghetto, his place of where he came from. And here's what happened. Nehemiah began to look back at where he came from. And here's what he found. He found that the town was in ruins. He found that the walls had been torn down. The doors, the gates were wide open, which means that they were open for pilferage at all times. Think about your home without a door. That's how it was. And so when Nehemiah saw the place from where he came from, he went to the Lord and he asked the Lord, Lord, look at my community. Look at where I came from. It's torn down in ruins. I would love to go back to build up my community. Well, here's what he did. He cried and he prayed, waiting for God to give him the proper time to talk to the king. Because you all know about the king, right? You couldn't just go before the king and just bring out a request, because if he wasn't in a good mood, here was the reply: off with your head. And so Nehemiah prayed and waited for God to give him the right time to ask the king for permission to go back to build the walls and to build the gates in his hometown. And here's what happened. One day, Nehemiah was coming in. The king noticed the sad look on his face. He asked Nehemiah, "What are you looking so sad about?" And Nehemiah began to explain to him about his town and about how the shambles that was in place in his town. Not only did the king give him the time off to go back and to rebuild the walls, but he also gave him the request of what he would need. All of the wood, the lumber, the best of everything that he needed, he gave Nehemiah to allow him to go back to rebuild the walls. But also he gave Nehemiah a letter that would allow him to pass by every governor he passed by to show that he had the rights from the king to go back and to build. Here's what happened. Not only did he just go back and begin to build, he understood that it took his predecessor 80 years to build these walls and gates that was built up prior to him that was now destroyed. But God had given Nehemiah a plan. And by Nehemiah using the plan that God had given him, Nehemiah was able to rebuild the walls and the gates in the city in 52 days, something that took 80 years for his predecessor. And so now today, I want to kind of share with you what happens when you take on a job. We're all like Nehemiah right now. We're trying to rebuild the walls of our lives. We're trying to go to God and asking God, listen, God, some people right now, you may still be laid off. You may still be on furlough. We're still waiting to see what's going to happen. Maybe you're receiving unemployment and now your stimulus money is gone. And now maybe the $600 that they was given at that time is there. And so now it seems like the walls in your life is torn down. But now I want to show you what Nehemiah did and what happens to all of us in these times of leadership of what we've got to do. So we're going to follow up this story. We're almost at the end. The walls are up and they're about to finish up the project. We're now in Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. Here's what it says. After the wall was finished and we had hung the doors in the gates and had appointed gatekeepers, singers, and Levites, I gave the responsibility of governing Jerusalem to my brother Hananiah and to Hananiah. So it's Hananiah and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, a very faithful man who revered God more than most people. So now they're at the end. The gates are up. He's given his last responsibilities to the last people, which is Hananiah and Hananiah, now to have the responsibility of governing now Jerusalem. The walls have been built back up again. And so today I want to just say this, that anytime there's a victory in your life, anytime we overcome something, anytime you move past something, there are two emotions that usually follow a great achievement. Those two emotions, the first one is always a sigh of relief and celebration. I'm sure here you see Nehemiah is celebrating. He was able to finish something in 52 days that it took his predecessor 80 years to do. But then after that first sigh of relief and that celebration, there's also now a second emotion that comes on. And that emotion is a sense of now what? I got over this one. Now what? Let me tell you why that's so important. Problems is something that'll never go away in our lives. I always say it like this when it comes to problems. If you're in a problem, then you got to hold on. You got to work through those problems. You got to make your way through those problems. If you right now are listening to me and you're not in a problem, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a deep breath and I want you to rest. You know why? Because you're on your way to a problem. Problems are cyclical. They just go around and around and around. And we know that Jesus told us that we will overcome those situations. He said, just like I have overcame, you also will overcome. So we know for a fact that as a leader, there are two emotions that follow any great achievement. I'm here to tell you that you will make it through this one. We've made it through the last, you'll make it through this one. But as a leader, you've got to understand that everything we go through, there is a lesson and a blessing for everything. So let me show you real quickly what we need to do based on these two emotions. There are two types of seasons in a leader's life, or two types of leadership seasons. And there are two seasons that you're going to go through on a regular basis as we go through the problem scenario, as we overcome and we get the lesson and the blessing from everything we go to or go through. There are two seasons. Now, the first season, there are 4 points that go with those seasons. The first season is when you're coming out of something, and that's what we've got to realize. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're trying to figure out when is things going to go to this new normal. But when you're in the middle of a pandemic where you are now, or if you're in a place in your life right now where you're in the midst of a situation that you're going to have to get out of, the first thing I want you to know about this season in your life as a leader is that you have to become the catalyst. You are the catalyst. What is a catalyst? A catalyst is that thing that makes things happen. It's that energy that is put into dynamite that makes the explosion. So you have to first become the catalyst as a leader in any situation. The worst thing in the world is to be a leader and the people are looking to you for direction and you're crying just like them. You've got to realize that as a leader, when you're going through a situation, your first step of this season is to become the catalyst. What does that mean? It's your job to get it going. It's up to you to get it going. But then the second thing you've got to do, you can't just be the catalyst and say, hey, let's get going. But you also have got to be the designer. The designer means what? You've got to be the person that's got to think up the plan. You can't just say, hey, let's go. Because people are going to say to you, go where? So you've got to have a plan. You've got to be like what the Bible says. You've got to write the vision, make it plain so that anybody can pick it up and run with it. You've got to be the designer in the midst of a situation. But not only are you the one to say, hey, let's get it going, and you're the one that thinks it up and draws it up, but you've also got to be the motivator. You've got to be the one to encourage people. You've got to be the one like Nehemiah that came down off the wall every 26 days to give people the message to why we're doing what we're doing. You've got to be that encourager. You cannot just put out a plan. You can't just say, let's get going and just keep cracking the whip and looking for the people to go. You've got to be the encourager. You've got to be like Nehemiah with the Bible in one hand and the hammer in the other, which means you've got to be working and you've got to be encouraging at the same time when you're going through. But then, too, you've got to be the entrepreneur in this scenario. You've got to understand that you've got to rely on yourself in the project more so than you do others. Why? Why do I rely on myself more than I do others? It's because through God, the plan comes from God to you. Because as the leader, you're the one going to God for direction. So God is speaking directly to you with the plan. So who does it rely on? It relies on you. You are the entrepreneur in this situation. That means you've got to rely on yourself more so than you do others. These are the 4 things that you need in the season when you're trying to overcome. When you're in one of those problems and you're trying to say, hey, where is the light at the end of the tunnel? These 4 things that we learned from Nehemiah are these 4 things that will help you get to a point where you can celebrate when you overcome a situation in your life. But remember, in every situation, there is a lesson and a blessing that needs to be learned. If I learn the lesson and I understand the blessing, it will prevent me from having to repeat this over and over again. So that's the first one. But the second season is when you're out. When you're out, you want to make sure that when you get out, you stay out. My grandmother used to say all the time when people would get healed or when somebody would be blessed financially, she would say this to me all the time. She says, it's one particular type of prayer that you get to be healed from something. It's one particular type of prayer that you pray that God hears that helps you turn over your finances. But there's another particular type of prayer that you've got to pray when you get out so that you can stay out. So there's one prayer to get me healed, but there's another type of prayer that I need in my life to stay healed. So again, it's possible to get out of a situation and find yourself right back into the situation because you don't do these 4 things when you're out. When you're out of a situation, here's what you've got to do. You turn from what you were before. Remember what you were before in the first one? Now you turn to the consolidator. You now don't cry out and say, hey, let's get going. Now you become the consolidator. You now figure out what needs to be consolidated that needs to stay now that we're out, what things need to go now that we're out. We need to consolidate those things for the goodness so that we can stay out. And so now it's not let's get going, it's let's keep going. As the consolidator, your job now is, hey, let's keep going. Remember, you're not the catalyst anymore. You're the consolidator. We're out now. We want to make sure we stay out. So as the consolidator, I'm saying, hey, everybody, let's keep going. And the second thing, you become the developer now. You're not the designer anymore. Remember, you were the designer to make the plan. Now you're the developer to make sure that the plan stays on track. It's your job now to make sure that the follow-ups are taken. See, it's one thing to say you want to be blessed financially, but it's another thing when you want to be blessed financially, but you have a regular way of putting away money. It's one reason to say, hey, I don't have money and I've been caught short-handed on this side. But it's another thing as a developer when you make sure that you're putting away money now so that when the rainy day comes, I have something to reach back to. So you move from the designer to the developer. But the third thing you do now is you turn from, again, we said that we were the motivator. Remember in the first one, we're motivating people, encouraging people. The third one, now we become the manager. We're now organizing things. We're making sure that the to-do lists are in place. We're making sure that the checkups are in place. We're making sure that we're watching those podcasts, watching those videos, reading those books, getting the things we need to do so that we can organize ourselves so that we can stay out of that hole that God has just blessed us to get out. And the last one is now we turn from the entrepreneur, we turn now to the executive. Now, remember, as the entrepreneur, when we're trying to get out, it was the entrepreneur because I was relying on myself because I was getting the plan from God. But now that we're out, I'm now the executive. Everybody knows the plan. We've written the vision. We've made it plain. Now everybody understands the plan. And now all of us now knows the plan. And my job now is to make sure that the plan is implemented.